This message was recorded at the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove in Asheville, North Carolina. Through the ministry of the Cove, we're training people in God's Word to win others to Christ. It's our goal to develop Christians who experience God through knowing Him better, knowing His Word, building godly relationships, and helping others know Him. We trust that this message will strengthen your walk with God and help you experience Him right where you are.
These are a dozen different arguments for the reliability of the New Testament. Now let me tell you how this fits into the course. I think an argument is stronger when you come at different independent angles. This is one big thing in calculation of probabilities. If you come from different angles and get the same conclusion, but you have two strong arguments, the point of independence is very important. This is not built, Ben could have added the minimal facts to this. He did a master's thesis and part of his PhD dissertation on the minimal facts. The minimal facts aren't even in here. It's a form of reliability. If you haven't thought of them that way, the minimal facts argument is a form of reliability, but it's not here. There are great arguments for the reliability of the New Testament. Now, what I started with, I called the minimal facts argument. Okay, what does that mean? It's a minimal case. This one is a maximal case. This one blasts you with why people think the New Testament's reliable. It doesn't go to, there's a little bit on inspiration at the end. But usually when you talk to unbelievers, you can't claim inspiration. They don't know what the work of the Holy Spirit is. Paul says you can't talk to unbelievers and expect them to believe things of the Spirit. So this is an historical argument for the reliability of the New Testament because in a lot of phrases, I'm going to warn you guys, you want those of you who want to take pictures, that's totally okay, but you're just not going to get everything. These things are just, well, I don't know, maybe you're faster than I am, but everybody's faster than I am on a computer. But, okay, textual evidence, genre, that's that biography that we discussed, dating, creeds. We've done enough of these things that many of them should be familiar to you. Authorship, historical criteria, undesigned coincidences, that's a real interesting category. Archaeology, non-Christian sources, non-canonical Christian sources like Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, Papias, names I've used this week, all of whom are about 25 to 30 years after the Gospel of John, so they're quite early. How did the canon develop? And Ben put this in, and he's got a great heart for this. Spiritual existential component. What should this mean to us? So I end with ministry points. Now, I'm not going to get through this the first hour. We're a little bit late anyway, but this one goes till, if my notes are right, 10:55. And then we have a short break and we have a full hour, I think. Yes, 11:15 to 12:15. So, sorry? Oh, no, you don't have to do that. I was going to do this in 1 hour, and I've done it in 1 hour before. But I figured if I slowed down and did it for 2, you'll miss a lot of details in 1 hour. So I thought I doubled up on the discrepancies yesterday, and I doubled up on another one earlier. So I left 2 for the end, and Shroud last night I knew it would go long, and it did, and so on. So there's the 12 again. All relying around the subject of New Testament reliability, and let's get started. All right, textual evidence for the New Testament. We've already talked about the texts are early, and we could do that in caps and lights and everything. Many, many, many copies. But look at the bottom. I haven't said this before. None of the differences between copyist statements we're talking about, none of them impact any major theological doctrine. If you counted well, I don't want to scare you with numbers, but in copyist mistakes, we're not talking about the original, but when monks copy and when that process goes on, copyist errors happen. People who type tell me that one of the worst things is when they're typing and 2 sentences start with the same word, oftentimes the next line gets skipped. And that stuff happens in manuscripts, but they're copyist mistakes. Norm Geisler passed away probably about a year ago, year and a half, but he was one of the top scholars in the country in apologetics. But even when he wrote his book, co-authored his book, Introduction to the Bible, way back in the 60s, he published it with Moody. So Norm is probably the most conservative, tightly interpreting apologist I know when he was alive. Moody, the most conservative press to the right of most of the what other evangelical presses will allow. And for that conservative scholar in a conservative press, he said in the 60s that there were over 200,000 copyist mistakes. Now, these are copies, nothing to do with inspiration. Inspiration, if you've never heard this, only applies to the originals. And you're going to say, well, like almost everybody says when they think about it, then why are we talking about inspiration? Because we don't have the originals. Okay, sit tight on that one. This will answer that. But 200,000. Today, they say up to 400,000 because we're finding, that's a problem with having more manuscripts than any other religion, is that you have more copyists. But let me say it again. These copyist mistakes have nothing to do with inerrancy because it only applies only to the originals. And the strength with the errors and the copies is the more copies you have, the more you can ascertain the underlying text. It's complicated, but I'm just saying for the most conservative guy in the most conservative press, and many years ago, it was 200,000. So this isn't a liberal conclusion at all. Criticism is often divided into higher criticism and lower criticism. Lower criticism is good translations, good Greek texts, getting the words right, things we all believe in. I've never been asked so much about this book. I've never been asked so much about any Bible I've bought to speaking engagement. And I was told today by Lee, she said, you could sell that and make a lot of money this week. Okay, but why am I using it? Because the guy is a very careful Greek scholar, and he's a whiz with verbs. And you can see things in here, like if you could, I gave you an example. John says Christians don't sin. Now, you know he can't mean sinless perfection, because in the same book, 1 John, he says, if we confess our sins, he's faithful and just to forgive us. And just a couple, we have to go to the next chapter. That's what, the first chapter. Second chapter, it begins with, but if we do sin, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ. So you know he's not teaching sinlessness. But then you go, why does he keep saying Christians shouldn't sin? But the Greek doesn't say that. You wouldn't get it from the English. If you're literally translating it, you're saying Christians don't sin. But the Greek word means they don't continue to sin. They don't live in sin. They're not characterized by sin. That's what the Greek says. And guys like this are going to bring that out in translations. Well, the more manuscripts you have, the more you can compare, and there's families of texts. And if somebody leaves the line out, and it's in that family over there, that group of seats, and those are all monks that copy, and they leave that line out, and somebody said, I don't know, I've memorized that passage, and I think you're missing something here. But you got this big group in the middle, because there is one family larger than the others, and then another family over there. They'll say, something's wrong with it, because when he makes a mistake down here, everybody else makes the same mistake. And some of the guys go, some of the translators, the monks, will go, there's a line here. They can't remember exactly what it is, so they put it in their own words. And they think putting in my own words is better than leaving it out. Well, you go to this family, and they didn't make this mistake because they have different manuscripts, and those two sentences didn't start with the same word, and they didn't make that mistake. So you go, this one helps. How are you guys? Well, we don't have that either. So now we know this sentence goes in there. That's why a lot of manuscripts are super. But with it, the copyist mistakes go up. But the copyist mistakes are absolutely zero. They don't mean anything because they can answer them. And Barterman, we've talked a lot about him this week, an atheist. And I said NC State, and I was corrected this week. It's University of North Carolina. And he used to be an evangelical. He's a Moody grad. And he walked away from it. And he's not a Christian, not a believer. And he studied under Bruce Metzger at Princeton Seminary. And Bruce Metzger could very well be the best Greek scholar who ever lived. Just an extraordinary fellow. What a lot of people don't know about Bruce Metzger is I was his secretary and the other officers for the Evangelical Philosophical Society for a while. He was a member of our society, and you have to sign a statement saying you believe in inerrancy. And he's probably the best Greek scholar of all time. Well, Bart Ehrman was his star pupil. Now, Bart fell away from the faith, but in Greek, he's really, really good. On this subject, there at the bottom, Bart agrees with his mentor. He agrees with Bruce Metzger, and he says, many copyist errors, but he says these two things. Here's the good news. We know where all of them are. See, if you know where things are, like a medical sickness or something, if you know where something is, you can treat it. The scary things are when you don't know where they are. You know where they are, you treat it. Bruce Metzger said, Bruce Metzger did say, and Ehrman quotes him, cites him, but Ehrman stunned me when I saw him say for the first time, we know where all of these are, and he said we'll probably not have any more. Now, we probably will, because we'll have new manuscripts, but he says we'll probably not have any more. We know where they are. We can correct them with this family thing I'm talking about. And here's the big thing. Even if you went with the differences, it doesn't change any theology. Nothing. Nothing to sacrifice because of it. Oh no, what if we lose the deity of Christ? Never happened. There's too many verses, too much backup, too much evidence. Okay? So no differences. Nothing to change that. All right, let's take a look. Now, I was doing this orally and just throwing things out. You folks want to see this graphically? Let's first talk, what are the earliest manuscripts from their time of writing to when we get the first copy? Remember I talked about Buddha 600, 800 years later? Okay, look at some of these. This is Homer. Homer, Tom Wright he said for ancient people, Homer was the Old Testament and Plato was the New Testament for ancient non-Christians. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey are major texts in the ancient world and somewhat of a religious purpose. Okay, the gap in Homer's the best one in terms of manuscript number. We'll see that in a second, next slide. But this is 400 years for him. Herodotus is the so-called father of history. He's Greek, a Greek historian, wrote about 7 centuries before Jesus, 6 centuries, 7th century is the 600s before Christ. So he's the father of Greek history. Look at that, 1,350 years. Plato, 1,300 years. And as one classical scholar says, he said, when I was taking my classics degree at an Ivy League school, my professor would come in and say, Plato said. They were reading Plato in the Greek. And he said, Plato said, Plato said, Plato said. The professor never says, well, Plato said, but this text is 1,300 years late, and we don't have very many copies. We don't have all these families, so it could have been adjusted, and maybe Plato never said this. He said, professor never said that. Professor said, Plato said. All right, now it's Gospel of John said. What? At plus 65? You see what I'm saying? It's not fair comparison. But they don't say that about these guys when they do it. Okay, Tacitus, this is his Annals, which is one of his 2 best-known books. 690 for Tacitus. And look at the New Testament. Now, when you get 30 years from the New Testament, this is when we get the books. Ben's going to talk about the creeds later. Creeds are oral. Remember, row, row, row your boat, and it gets written down later. This is a time gap of only 30 years to the first book. Now, we're talking Gospels, folks, because we're mostly doing the Gospels here. This is Mark. First Thessalonians is plus 20. And creeds, days later, months later, okay? Now, this is in terms of years between the person and the writing and our copies. This is how many fragments they have. Now, as I said, Homer is somewhat of a religious book in the ancient world, wrote centuries before Christ, and he's got by far the most copies for outside the Testaments. He's got 1,750 copies. You'll see that's incredible. So probably we've got enough to put together the original Iliad and the original Odyssey. We can put it together. Look at the rest. Back to Herodotus, 110. That's not enough to get the text straight, especially when your text is 110 at 1,300 years later. Plato, 210 copies. Tacitus's Annals, look at that, 31. Now, Ben didn't put this in here, but there's another problem, a huge problem. And Livy, L-I-V-Y, is another Roman historian who's probably equal to Tacitus as the two best-known Roman historians. Do you know that of Livy's like 140 books of history, only about a third of them exist today? They're not anywhere, as far as we know. We'll probably find them in this monastery someday, but we don't have Livy. So it's one thing to say, hey, your gap is pretty big. Yep. Your copies are not very many. Yes. And we don't have 2/3 of your work. I used the example the other day that Mike Lacconi uses, where he compares the New Testament to ancient history. And many of the guys he deals with are like Livy, where they've lost many of their works. I mean, the parts of their work are no longer. It'd be like having a New Testament and knowing there's 27 books and we only have 9 of them, or 14 of them. We don't have the rest of them. We knew people wrote them, but we don't know what they said. We don't have them. So, when you remember how big Homer was on the left down there? Look at the New Testament. 5,700 plus, and let me tell you something. You want to just take another deep breath on this one? Those are Greek copies only. In the 3rd century AD, Latin texts started being translated by Jerome. He's before Augustine. And I'm trying to remember how many Latin texts there are, but there are thousands of Latin texts. You put them together, and that 5,700 is going to swell immensely. So, yeah, Homer's great until he, this is a football game. Final score, 5,700 to 17,000, because that'd be a basketball game. 5,700 to 1,750. But Homer's the best there is, and he got killed. Here's some of the ways you check textual evidence and where a lot of the copyist mistakes come in. Some of them are just spelling errors. You get a same word. Now you hear people say sometimes, if they spell somebody's name incorrectly and it gets spelled that way for a lot of manuscripts, each one of those counts for a copyist error. It does not. That's not the way they count them. If you have 500 misspellings of one word through all those deals, that only counts one. So there is a significant number of variant readings. And always keep in mind, in the copies, and the strongest Christians in the most conservative seminaries have the same number liberals do. They agree to how many there are. But usually they're not that big or important. But here's Bart Ehrman. Scholars are convinced that we can reconstruct the original words of the New Testament with reasonable, although probably not 100% accuracy. Listen, if an atheist says, we can't quite get 100%, that's a huge compliment. They're not telling you, they're saying things like this. In some cases, seriously, it is it a something or is it the something? I don't think anybody's going to lose sleep over that. But the difference is very little, and it can be reconstructed, probabilistic. We probably have the right reading. There are other New Testaments like this one. If you know Greek, the tool that we use in Greek classes, it's a red plastic covered New Testament, and they have all the minor variants at the bottom of the page. So when you're reading it, you can see all the variants. And you can see they're minor things. And they can be figured out because we have these families that answer. But even Ehrman says, well, I guess another way to say that is we're pretty close to 100, but we're not at 100. But we can pretty much get the whole text. All right, now we talked about the Gospels being biographies. That's the book on the left. Remember I told you about Richard Burridge? He was a classic scholar at University of London. He did his dissertation showing that the New Testament was a biography, the same way Roman biographies and Greek biographies are. That's the book. And notice what he says. There are various genres in the New Testament. The Gospels are believed to be written in the genre of Greco-Roman biography. Bios, it's often spelled with an S, but and an I. That's not a misspelling, it's spelled with an I too. Bios, Greco-Roman. And here's the difference. Look at the bottom. Unlike other genres, as in novels, biographies were not expected to produce free compositions. You weren't just allowed to talk like in a novel. They were supposed to be writing down good history. And that's what the Gospels are. This has been a huge change. It's happened about 1990, and it's pretty much, it's what everybody wants to do. Write a doctoral dissertation that changes the whole field. And that's what happened with that book. You can see his name in the lower right, Richard A. Burridge. He's British. All right, dating. We've done a lot of that this week. But let's take a little look. Jesus' death is either 30 or 33 AD. 30 is by far the most common. Mark's gospel is 60s to early 70s. That survey that Mike Lacona did with his master's student at Houston Baptist University, the most common date from critics was 60s to 70. It was on the lesser end. It was on the younger end of this. Critics now, not evangelicals, critics, as I said, date Matthew and Luke Acts to about 85. Sometimes they do push Acts up a little bit. They'll put it up with John sometimes. But the creeds in Acts, the sermon summaries, they got back to the 30s. Okay. John, early to mid-90s. Go back. Look where, you all see what I just did? That's the Gospels. Look what shows up next. Paul. You see how early Paul's epistles are to the Gospels? And here's the data we just gave you. Now let's compare. I gave you another quote on Buddha. Ben's using a different book. The one I had is the one where the person says, we don't have what you Christians have. You have the words of your Lord, we don't. You have the words of those who study under your Lord, we don't. You have the words of those who studied under those who studied under your Lord, we don't. We don't have any of that. In fact, he says, we don't even know what Buddha taught. And when he gets to the later chapter on what Buddha taught, he says, again, I already told you, we don't know what Buddha taught. It's horrible if you're going to follow him. But you can read these key lines that for 400 years after Buddha, they talked about these things. And you go, well, isn't that like our creeds? Well, first of all, our creeds are, they're almost all in the 30s, which is 10. Some of them are before Paul's conversion, which is 32 to 33. This is for 400 years. That does sound more like phone tag. But keep reading. Down at the bottom, we talk about reciting. They said that there was one monk who claimed to be able to cite all of Buddha's words, if you read this. But he was somewhat arrogant, so when people ask what Buddha said, he didn't like to repeat it. He liked to keep it to himself. Well, you know what? Maybe he kept it to himself because he didn't memorize the whole thing. Anyway, I mean, when you're in grad school, most of us spend time with languages like Greek, Hebrew, German, and French. But you don't want someone giving you a vocabulary test on the spot. Oh, yeah? Well, what does this mean? Agnosticis, Igeru, etc. Well, those are easy. They're resurrection. But they can give you other words. Abba, that's an easy one too. And that's Aramaic. But if they throw these things out, nobody wants to be tested. And when this guy's tested, maybe he just didn't produce. They blamed it on his arrogance. When we hear this, we feel a little uneasy, knowing that an arrogant monk may not have been the best vehicle to transmit the teachings of Buddha. And it was still hundreds of years later. This is just not an issue in Christianity. Now, another topic. Notice we're moving through the topics, the 12 that we started with at the beginning. Creeds. This is all repeat for you. Jesus' death, 30 AD. Paul's writings. You got Mark, and so on. And the same years for Mark there at the bottom. Same years for the Gospels and Paul there at the bottom. All right, down at the bottom, the bracket around the Gospels, the creeds are at the earliest stage. Whoop, let me back up. There we go. That's the one slide I didn't get up. 30 to 50, because some of them are later. Remember I told you the be-all, end-all date has to be the date of the gospel. It has to be the date of the book. If the creed is in the book, the creed is earlier. So it could go up to 40 for 1 Thessalonians. And I told you just yesterday, we had the question about 1 Timothy and the block quotes in the translation. It could go up until the last ones. And the last of Paul's epistles could be, say, 62. He died shortly after that. Yes? Oh, I thought you had your hand up. No. I do that sometimes too. I adjust these new guys. I want to make sure you all see them. All right. 30 to 50. But Mark's written there later. And I already told you about the book from Jimmy Dunn, James D.G. Dunn, who had the book Jesus Remembered. I told somebody this in private. I may not have talked about that book publicly. Jesus Remembered, Dunn was doing work on sources behind the Gospels. It's really exciting stuff. But he was arguing that people took notes while Jesus was speaking. Now, let me give you an example. Where are you folks again? How many of you have seen The Chosen? All right. I'm curious. Yell this out if you like it. I mean, if you have a view. Who's your favorite apostle in The Chosen? There's a couple personalities that are pretty strong. Who? Peter. He's cantankerous. He's always pushing guys and almost starting fights. But he's real firm and he loves the Lord. He's real close to him. But he's a little firebrand, right? He's cool. Who else do you like? Matthew. We hear Matthew more than anybody else. Matthew is on the autistic spectrum. And we have a friend, a very good friend. He's proud of it. He'd come walking right up, and I could mimic him. I've been with him so much, I could mimic his speech. I could mimic what he does. And he's brilliant. He's a brilliant philosopher. He's working on his MA right now and plans to go on for a PhD. He's really sharp, but he's got a lot of personality, interesting things, like he eats food with his fingers. He just cannot use utensils. He's scared of water. And when we first met him, the only food he ate was pizza. Breakfast, noon, and dinner, pizza. But he's brilliant. And that's how, for those of you who haven't seen it, that's Matthew. When he walks around, he's got this little tiny gait just like this, and that's just how our friend does it. Eileen did step out here for a second, but one time they went to the mall with he and his wife, and the women went off one place shopping, and our friend's name, he was with his wife, his name's Nick. He went off alone. And they decided to meet in the middle of the mall. And Nick hadn't returned yet. And his wife says, he's coming. He said, how do you know? I can tell. And then around the corner, here comes Nick, and he's humming to himself. And that's Matthew in this program. But he's really sharp. And the reason the Romans need him is that he's super good with numbers, and they want the most money out of everybody. And so he's doing it. But he meets Jesus and he walks away, just like in Scripture. He walks away. It figures he would be something like this, because this guy in those days, how many mathematicians are you going to find? And he's brilliant. Well, you know what he's doing for the rest of the program? Only the first little bit's out. But he and Andrew are the two note takers. And because Matthew learns about math and keeping notes, I heard you got so many fish last month, and that's going to be $10. And he does taxes. He's got to keep track and write. So he's taking notes while Jesus is speaking. And then every once in a while, Andrew will say, it's like you folks with your phones, Andrew will say, hey, Matthew, I missed that sentence. What was it? And he takes out his elaborate book. What he said was, and he repeats it. And Andrew says, I remember something like that. No, he said exactly that. Andrew goes, okay, I'll add it to my notes. A little bit later, Matthew might even ask Andrew, but they're the two note takers. And James D.G. Dunn has done a 1,000-page book arguing that the Gospels had note takers. And he puts the Greek, he's not guessing, he puts the Greek text up there. And you know how you can tell creeds already? You know, different language, words that are not used by that person anywhere else. Sometimes they introduce them by saying, here's a faithful saying. Well, Dunn puts the gospel, they're harder to find in the Gospels, and they're not really creeds. He's looking for notes. And he puts texts up, and you'll flip text, and there's texts of Greek. And he'll show you how there's evidence that they're drawing from a source. And now we know Luke had sources, and, you know, Mark is Mark when it's all three, and Matthew used Mark, and Luke used Mark, and Matthew and Luke used it when Mark didn't. You know all that. But these are like everyday little note portions. And he argues for that. So these things are extremely, in fact, I may have gotten ahead of Ben here because I think he brings that up. Okay, now, critics, there's still a majority of critics who take the middle two options, is what I'm told. Mark and Luke Acts. The two more disputed ones are Matthew and John, and the most disputed gospel by critics is Matthew. But what Ben has done here is assemble some sources for Matthew. Look at the quote here from Richard Bauckham. We've used the name in class here. Jesus and the Eyewitnesses is his book. No evidence exists that these gospels were ever known by other names. The universal form of the titles and the universal use of them, as soon as we have any evidence, suggests that they are original in an early stage. See, the names don't really appear till I believe it's the 2nd century, the names on the Gospels. But he says we can trace them back, and he's a specialist in this area. He's one of the best known. And he said we can trace them back. So you look there, Matthew, Papias, 125 to 130, Irenaeus, 180. For Mark, Papias again, he's the one that said Mark was Peter's interpreter. Justin Martyr, 150, in Memoirs of Peter. Luke, Marcion. Marcion's a heretic. He's one of the early proto-Gnostics that will lead to, and he made his own canon, and he only accepted a little bit of the New Testament. The only gospel he took a fragment of Luke. It's the only thing he used. But the point is, he said Luke was the author, and that's what we're talking about here. So even a critic there, remember, enemy attestation. So, and for John, the evidence that John is the author of this gospel is stronger than for any other gospel. The evidence for John is the strongest. Gotta watch my time here. Got about 10 more minutes. Okay. The undisputed Pauline letters. We started the course with this. You've got going from the top and going around clockwise. Romans, 1st, 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians. Here's Luke. Ben is using a minimal facts type argument by citing not so much minimal facts, but he's citing critics. Luke Timothy Johnson says nearly all critical scholars accept 7 letters. He names these. Although when he teaches his intro class, he's the one I told you about the other day, he uses all 15. He says you cannot differentiate the later epistles of Paul, like the pastoral epistles. He said you cannot. This is like the biggest argument critics use. The Greek seems to be different. Remember we had that talk in here about how we all use different language, and Paul used amanuenses, or, you could say co-authors. And that will change your language. But Johnson says 7, he uses all 13. Paul Barnett, the Australian historian I used the other day, New Testament scholars will note that these letters are not disputed. And Jimmy Dunn, it's kind of funny. He goes by Jimmy, which sounds like he's Southern, but he's British. They can certainly be attributed to Paul himself. All right? So that's the next one. You know what? I've got about 8 minutes here. We got historical criteria. We're doing fine. There's 37 slides. Can I clear up anything in the next few minutes? If not, I'll go right on. But yes.
I would like to know that Buddha thing that you keep showing us. Is that the people who say that the kid that keeps being born and born and born?
You mean either reincarnation or what's often called transmigration of souls?
Yes, every time the kid's born,
yeah.
they keep it from everybody.
Yes, the question is Buddha the one that teaches transmigration of the souls, otherwise known as reincarnation? Yes, so do Hindus. And they're 2 of the larger religions if you get past the 3 monotheisms, Christianity, Judaism. Well, Judaism is kind of small in numbers, but of course Christians use the Old Testament, and Muslims, Christians and Muslims. I just saw a number the other day that a Muslim said there's 1.5 billion Muslims in the world. Christians now are just over 2 billion, about 2.2 billion. So those 2 together, Christians and Muslims, would be over 3.5 billion. But so they're probably the next 2, Buddhism and Hinduism, and they do believe in transmigration. They do believe in reincarnation.
Why do they believe that?
There's a lot of reasons, but when you ask them about reasons, they have all kinds of examples where little kids were born and the little kid says, don't call me, I'm not using, they don't have English names, but I mean, if they're, truly live there, but the guy might say, quit calling me Peter, my name's John. What? My name's John. Who are you, John? And he gives the last name. And this is a great uncle who died 30 years before. And that uncle had a scar on his left shoulder, and the little kid has a scar on his left shoulder. And they'll hear things like that. And there's other options for what's going on there, very well-known options. But they'll use things like that to say that shows the reincarnation. Since you brought that up, let me tell you something. This might be convenient if someone's talking to you and they talk about reincarnation being true. It's making its way in the U.S. I mean, even 20, 30 years ago, they took a survey where 25% of Americans believed in reincarnation. So it is with us. You got to deal with it. But here's the #1 reincarnation expert in the world. He died a few years ago. He's a medical doctor. He's a psychiatrist from the University of Virginia. He wrote at least 5 books on reincarnation. He traveled around the world and interviewed these little kids and saw their birth spots and so on. There are a lot of cases like that. Some things are really interesting. They are found outside of India and Burma and around that area. They are found, but they're almost exclusively the Eastern religions, which makes you think, how come we don't see that in Christian or other religions? But this guy's the #1 scholar. His name is Ian Stevenson, the psychiatrist, MD. And after doing all this research, he sifts all the possible causes, what else this could be. And a lot of people say, well, how come he calls himself John, and how come he's got that scar on his back and all this stuff? Here's Ian Stevenson's conclusion. If you have a copy of the book J.P. Moreland and I co-authored, it used to be called Immortality. Then in its later version, it's called Beyond Death. I've got a chapter in there on reincarnation. It was pre-computer. I would send it to you if you wanted it. I don't have it. I mean, I would get it the same way you would. You have to Xerox the chapter if you're dealing with somebody, I guess, or buy the book. You can get it inexpensively for like $4 or $5. And it's a big book. I think it's almost 500 pages. But we give a bunch of critiques. And here's Stevenson. I'll just give you one. Stevenson says there's only 2 hypotheses that fit all the data. One of them is reincarnation. You know what the other one is? Possession. And you go, oh my, that settles it. If this guy is, now there's 2 kinds of possession. We only hear about demon possession. There's another kind that Stevenson, it's known by people other than Stevenson, but he popularized it. It's called discarnate possession. Discarnate is when a person who dies in the spirit world is the one who inhabits the person. In other words, it's still possession, but it's by a formerly living people who now is presumably being used by somebody or a demon. He says it's the only one the other one that makes sense. And I'm thinking, if you got choices between reincarnation and possession, and these are mostly found in these Eastern countries, and when you read their literature, they'll tell you drugs and the occult are major things they study in these religions. I'm not making this up. I've got this from their biographers. Drugs, one of them says, drugs and the occult were never far away from us. And this is a guru who says this. When you mix those with you know what I mean? Now, this is looking to me like it's a culture where that other stuff's going on. I've said it before in speeches. I'll opt for whatever you think about discarnate possession by a person, whether you get that or not. I think either one of the kinds of possession is more likely than reincarnation. Steve?
Yeah, there you go. For our listening audience, I've read of critics that said that John the Apostle could not have been the author of John based on his first-hand knowledge of what happened in the trial, and they've labeled the author as John the Priest, whoever that might be. Have you ever encountered that, and how do we respond?
Richard Bauckham, I think Richard Bauckham's an evangelical, the author of, I've just never asked him, but he's a great guide. He wrote that book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. It's a fantastic book on reliability. And he opts for John, but there's another John in the early church. You know why they say John the priest? Because John apparently knew the priest, it says in the book, but we don't have any record, as far as I know, we don't have an historical record of a John the priest. We do have an historical record of a guy right after John's time who's called John the Elder. And some people think it's the Apostle John. Some people think it's a different John. But he's right on the heels of John the Apostle, and he was real close to the apostles. He was like a sub-apostle. We don't hear much about him, but there's a fair amount of material about him. And Richard Bauckham, maybe because he thought, I don't know, maybe Richard thought he would be laughed at more than he needed to be to say it was John and take a stance at that time was not too popular. He thinks the author of the fourth gospel is John the Elder, which that John would be as close to John as Mark is to Peter or Luke is to Paul. So that would make John not an apostle, but very close, again, like the other guys are using people, like Luke is not an apostle, like Mark is not an apostle. So yeah, I've heard that. It's a really minor view, but Richard Bauckham's a good scholar. So
one quick follow-up question then. If John was the one that ran with no clothes from the garden.
No, Mark.
That was Mark.
That's in the Gospel of Mark. We don't know it's Mark, but Mark's the one that records it.
Okay.
As he was running, they grabbed his cloak and he ran right out of it.
All right.
I mean, this is kind of a funny case, but he wasn't running around nude or anything. They grabbed him, and that's when they were catching people, and he ran out of his clothes to escape. Okay. That gown thing. You know, I always wondered when people say in the Old Testament that there was an argument, a real tight fundamentalist argument in the 60s, like from the people who said you shouldn't wear choir robes and don't wear beetle glasses because that's too much like the culture. If you remember, if you never came from that culture, be glad. But But some of them are really tight. And one of them said, men shouldn't wear slacks to church or anywhere else because men and women are not supposed to wear the same kinds of clothes. And they use some verse from Deuteronomy, which doesn't seem to say anything like that. But the funny thing to me is, don't wear pants. Pants are for the men. Right. All right. What was it like in the Old Testament? They both wore a sheet, right over there, put a hole in it and put the sheet down. And you can't tell the men from the women in the Old Testament. So don't use that argument for blue jeans, you know what I mean? But that's an example. So it was a one-piecer, and he could have been, if he was grabbed it, he could, put his arms up and take his head out and just run away. And that's apparently what happened. And people think it might have been an autobiographical comment. It might have been a young Mark before this gospel was written, but we don't know who it was. You know what? I saw another hand. Let me start with that if you want. Okay, you want to take one before the break? Is that fine? Okay, fire away.
I think after Bart Ehrman's book came out, arguing that John wasn't written by John, Mark wasn't written by Mark, etc. Some apologists conceded, okay, it doesn't matter whether we know the authors, it wasn't even, like you mentioned, it wasn't even written, that it was never signed, that Mark was written by Mark, etc. So it doesn't really matter. What matters is the content. Do you think that's problematic? Do you think it does matter that we need to prove authorship, apostolic authorship? Because how do we tell then that the canon, apart from the pseudepigrapha, where authorship was a huge criteria for how we tell them apart?
They would say, this is Peter, the book was written 100 years later. So the apocryphal and pseudepigraphal books lied. Yeah, I think it's very important to know who the author is if we can tell. The toughest one is Matthew. Matthew's a real tough haul on an historical argument. Now, I don't throw Matthew out. But if you're only doing data, I think we should do whatever we can. Now, maybe the clearest one in the Gospels is John. And what do you do with this verse? Chapter 21 is often said to be a Johannine appendix written by his community in Ephesus to say it's a stamp of approval on the rest of the gospel. Anyway, here's how it's written here. It's right after Jesus said, feed my sheep, to Peter. In verse 21-24, this is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down, and we know that his testimony is true. Now, it's said, the author in John is said to be the one that leaned on his breast at the communion. And now when you put that all together, for example, you know which apostle is not mentioned in the book of John? John. Now, there's only one John. In all the other Gospels, there's John the Baptist and John. Here, there's John, but John is John the Baptist. So there's little hints like that. And then this thing, this is the disciple. Who's the disciple who testifies? You back up. This is where he said, Peter, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And then Peter said, what about him? Because John was standing there. And Jesus said, if I want him to stay here till I come, that's not your business, so carry on with your work. Here's the statement just before it. This is the disciple. Who? Previous statement. So the report got out to the brothers that this disciple was not going to die. But Jesus did not tell him that he was not going to die. He said only, if I wish him to wait until I come, what is that to you? It's John. And then it says, this is the disciple who testifies these things. There seems to be a nice little imprimatur right there saying, stamp of approval on the Gospel of John.